Squabble. With us today is Dr. Gary Habermas, a distinguished research professor of apologetics and philosophy and chairman of the Department of Philosophy at Liberty University in Lynchburg, Virginia. He has more than 45 books, 80 chapters to other books, and more than 100 articles to his credit. He received a Doctor of Philosophy degree from Michigan State University in History and Philosophy of Religion, and is also a reviewer of the Journal of Near-Death Studies out of the University of Virginia, the only peer-reviewed near-death journal in the world. His chief area of interest and study are in the areas of evidence and what kind of evidence we have for the resurrection of Jesus and for near-death experiences. Also with us today, Dr. Michael Licona. And Mike is an American New Testament scholar and author. He is also an associate professor in theology at Houston Baptist University. And Mike, Wikipedia says you are an extraordinary associate professor of theology at Northwest University and director of Risen Jesus. What's the extraordinary bit?
Well, that word means something a little bit different. It means something a lot more like what we would think it would mean on the surface in South Africa than it does here. So extraordinary is not like extraordinary. It's like, well, it's outside of the ordinary. So it's basically like an adjunct professor. So they use me sometimes to be an external reader for doctoral dissertations. So I do have an affiliation with them over there. But no, I'm with Houston Baptist University. And in fact, they just changed their name to Houston Christian University.
Yeah, I saw that. Right. Well, I've known you since about 1979, and you're extraordinary too. So thanks for checking in with us this morning. And Gary, let's start off with you and tell us a little bit about your spiritual journey and how you became interested in subjects like souls and near-death experiences.
Well, the way I usually say it is my life, let's say my middle life, was framed, bookended by two deaths of the two most important people to me in my life. The first was my great-grandmother, and people would say great-grandmother, most important person, but everybody in the family knew she was that to me, and my parents thought it was wonderful that we had that relationship. And every time we'd visit, the kids would go out and play, and I'd spend my whole day in the room with her. And when that happened, when she died, a few years later, I began wondering, was there any hope for an afterlife? And it was doubts, but it was more like doubts in search of evidence. And I wondered if there was any reason to believe in an afterlife. And that first period went about 10 years. And then I had a second on and off period of 10 years for a total of 20. And a few years after the end of my doubt, by God's grace, it has been gone from my life. As a matter of fact, I've gone in the opposite direction. I'm almost immune to doubts. There's so much data out there. When someone gives me something new, I just shrug and say, yeah, well, that's not going to work. But at the end of my doubt period, my wife at that time and my mother, the mother of my 4 children, died of stomach cancer when she was only 43 years old. And I thought to myself, great, my doubts are probably going to come back. And I even wrote that in a publication and said, I'm expecting them to come back anytime. But they never did. And so my whole life that midlife has been framed around evidence for an afterlife, and if there is any. And early in the 1970s, before I finished my PhD, I got into near-death experiences, 1972, and I started grabbing whatever material was out there, and it wasn't much. But I interviewed Elizabeth Kubler-Ross one time, and I've been with Raymond Moody and those guys. So I've been pursuing the afterlife thing ever since then. And last point, a lot of Christians came alongside me and said, why don't you check out this evidence? Why don't you check out that evidence? And they interested me, but I didn't think archaeology and scientific evidence for creation, what we might call intelligent design today, I didn't think a lot of those moved the ball much. I didn't think they showed anything to be true. And I read one day that if Jesus was raised from the dead, it would evidence Christianity and evidence our future life. And I read that statement. I thought, whoa, it just clicked. I remember the day I read it.
Mm-hmm.
I remember the book I was reading. I remember where I was in the book. And it just made sense. But here's the problem. I didn't know if the resurrection happened. I had no idea. So that started me on a really long journey. Mm-hmm. And that's about it. After I finished my doctor's degree, I say this because a lot of people think you're really young when you go through doubts and therefore they don't count. After I finished my PhD, I played around with scientific Buddhism for a long time. And it's not an exaggeration, in my mind anyway, to say that I nearly became a Buddhist after my PhD. Mm-hmm. And now as I look back on it, I think it's the silliest thing I ever considered. But at the time, it made sense. So that's my life, dealing with doubt and the answers to that, which factually anyway has a lot to do with evidence.
Great. Mike, what about you, your spiritual journey?
Well, I was seeking God early in life, probably around the age of 7 or 8 years old. And I remember asking my mom, how do I get to heaven? We'd be on our way walking to church in the morning. And she'd say, well, you just have to do more good than bad. And I said, well, I have a little sister. I pulled her hair, hit her, made her cry. What if I do more bad than good? And she said, well, then you go to be with the devil in hell forever. And I'm thinking, well, where am I on that scale? And so one day after my mom remarried, I was 10 years old, and they brought a Christian magician into church. And so he was doing these tricks, these illusions, whatever you want to call them. But he would relate the gospel message to it, that it wasn't anything that I did in terms of being good. It's what Christ did for me on the cross. And it's like, he gave an invitation. It was a Presbyterian church, and he gave an invitation, and 3 of us went forward. I'm thinking, I don't know why everybody isn't going forward. This is exactly what I've been looking for. And so I consider that to be the day I became a Christian. I got tricked into the kingdom. I didn't grow too much spiritually as a teen. I ended up going to Liberty University, where Gary teaches, but I was a music major. But I was really growing spiritually while there. It was just really a fertile ground for me at that time. And I wanted to get deep into scripture and learn how to read the New Testament in its original language. So I applied for and got accepted into a Master of Arts program in New Testament studies. And I took as much Greek as I could. I took the equivalent of 5 years of graduate level Greek courses. And my final semester, I'm spending a lot of time in prayer, an hour to 2 hours a day. I'm reading scriptures for hours a day in their original language. And then one day I just asked myself the question, is this stuff really true? I think it's true. I mean, I believe I've got this intimate relationship with God. I feel like I sense his presence at times, but maybe I've just tricked myself into thinking that maybe, what about people of other religious beliefs? Do they have these kinds of experiences? And so one of my roommates suggested I go see Gary. And so I did. And that's how I met him. I knocked on his door. He invited me in. He was really kind and, let me discuss my doubts with him and what I was struggling with. And I don't know, maybe 20 minutes later, I walked out feeling reassured about my faith. After finishing up my coursework in grad school, I got married. Then we ended up in Baltimore and started having doubts again. So I called Gary, and he was really patient and worked with me through them and would refer, we could talk about these things. They had no email back then. So we could talk through these things. We could, he'd recommend books to me and journal articles, send me some of those. And so that really helped me. That got me hooked on apologetics, got me hooked on the resurrection of Jesus, and Yeah, there have been times that I doubt after that, several times. But my doubt is more of emotional doubt rather than um,
Right.
intellectual doubt. It's like, well, what if I'm wrong?
Hmm.
What if I'm wrong? Yeah, but I've looked at the evidence. Yeah, but still the consequences could be so horrible. What
Hmm.
if I'm wrong? And those are the things that kind of make me
I
anxious.
see that. I see that a lot, Mike. I see a lot of people I speak with and talk to on social media. I see a lot of the emotional block, sometimes way more than the intellectual, because they've been so traumatized by a religious person or someone in their family that they just don't want to hear it anymore. They were raised and kind of tortured by overzealous Christian parents and just don't want anything to do with it. Oh, and by the way, I've seen your wife Debbie touting your Greek abilities, on Facebook, so we realize how good they are. Right? What, like 5 years of Greek, right?
Yeah, and yeah, 5 graduate level courses in Greek, 5 years of graduate level courses, and then I read the Greek New Testament on a regular basis.
Right, right.
Is how I do it. But
Mm.
yeah, I mean, and I'm not an expert in it like Dan Wallace or a number of others, but I probably read the Greek New Testament as much as most other New Testament folks do.
Okay. Well, I don't know how much we'll need that today, but let's move on into this. We're talking about souls and near-death experiences and reincarnation. And Jackie will jump in with her questions as she wishes. And I guess right off the top, Gary, it's like, what is a human soul, and how would you respond to someone who said that the idea of a soul was just an outdated religious notion and that you're just your brain?
Yeah. Okay. Well, the definition comment first. In the Old Testament, Mike could probably answer this better than I could, the first part. But if I'm not mistaken, in the Old and New Testaments, especially the Old Testament, you see this soul simply means life. Something that's living has a soul, and animals are said to have souls in
Mm-hmm.
Scripture. That means, if the dog's walking around, it's alive and it's got a soul. Um, I I don't like the old discussion of, tripartite. Where I was taught way before I got to graduate school, body, soul, and spirit. Well,
Mm-hmm.
okay. If I have a body and I have a spirit, I'm alive. So we can leave doubt. We can leave soul out of that one. I prefer to talk about material and immaterial parts, or if someone prefers, a body and a spirit. I think the immaterial portion, I'm happy with the word spirit. I'm probably even happier with the phrase um, immaterial. So
Okay. Mm-hmm.
persons have a material and immaterial spirit,
Mm-hmm.
and it's the latter that I got interested in because there are just incredible loads of data on behalf of an afterlife that have nothing to do with the resurrection. And then
Mm-hmm.
you throw the Christian view in there, and the resurrection shapes those ideas. Usually,
Mm-hmm.
those evidences, by the way, are not worldview specific. You could be any religion
Mm-hmm.
and take advantage of these evidences for an afterlife. And you can say, okay, so there's an afterlife.
Mm-hmm.
But now we have a separate question. Mike's question when he was growing up. What's the best way to approach that? How do we know that one specific view is true and
Mm-hmm.
what is so? Is it there? And if it's there, what's the best way to go to it? And I guess that'd be the way I would introduce it.
Okay. Well, I've heard people like J.P. Moreland refer to the spirit as being a faculty of the soul. Do you see it that way?
Well, it's part of us. It's part of our life. If we're dead, that's part of your other question too. The
Mhm.
brain, I think, is an organ,
Yeah.
and the spirit works through a brain,
Right.
but spirits work without brains.
Hmm.
And that's pretty clear. For example, in dozens of NDE cases now, as much as all the data can be measured, there are dozens of cases where the person involved, let's say the NDEer,
Hmm.
has no heart activity and no brain activity.
Right.
And I can explain that if you want, but no heart or no brain activity. And yet they're reporting data from either inside the room that's really incredible or more evidential. They're reporting data from a mile away that is readily, or 7 floors away in the hospital where their family's waiting in a waiting room. They can report data, sentences, comments that are verified, doctor's reports that are true. There are over 300 of evidenced NDE cases now. And so I think that is what you're talking about. I think that is the spirit operating. It operates through the brain, but the brain is not the organ. So we shouldn't even talk like, well, yeah, but when that guy's laying there in the casket, his brain's not working, so he can't be living. That's just like, that's a non sequitur.
So that the brain, I mean, the soul is disembodiable, if that's a word, but I mean, everything else is physical. So they're just,
it's very easily seen. A very easy example would be of the millions, and you heard me right, millions of near-death experiences now in the world. A recent medical book said probably 20 million in the West alone, up 9 to 20 million. All right. The person sees themselves up above the body looking down. They report things that are evidenced. But when their heart stops and the doctor starts beating on them, they start screaming at the doctor, "Stop beating on me. That hurts." They don't know if it hurts or not, but stop it, stop it, stop it. Just let me go. I want to go. Cut me loose. I want to go where I am now. And guess what? Nobody listens to them. Nobody's heard them. Nobody can hear them screaming. So that right there, I don't know what it is, but right there is a realm other than the workaday world that we live in.
Well, when you start venturing into that area, it seems like you're kind of like in the Twilight Zone or a Stephen King movie, right? When you start talking about souls leaving the body, and here we are in October now too, when you got Halloween and people thinking about those types of things, souls leaving the body and talking to other souls. And I've heard you say in the past, even with maybe making some appearances to living people or sharing data with other souls that are kind of maybe incontrovertible.
There are different categories of near-death phenomena. By far the best known ones are NDEs. Like I said, tens of millions around the world.
Yeah.
But you have things like deathbed visions, where a person sees something and of course the verifiable cases are best of all, but where someone sees something on the bed, whether they're in the bed, there's some of them, I mean, I can tell you, but some of them are highly evidential, and nobody else in the room sees what this person's seeing. But you go, that sounds like an hallucination. But sometimes the 5 people in the room share what the other person is seeing. And there's a fair amount of backup on that. That's a deathbed vision. Then you've got post-death visions or post-death experiences where, an actual case is one of my PhD students, a Baptist pastor. His dad before him was a Baptist pastor. And the night they buried his mother, his dad was in the bedroom. They'd been separated for the first time in almost 70 years. And he said a mom appeared to his dad at the foot of the bed. She didn't say anything. She stood there for a few seconds and disappeared. That's a post-death vision. Some of those happen with 5 people in the room, or the person who appears. If they say a message, it's this one. They almost always say, "I'm doing fine. Don't worry about it. Got to go now." And it only lasts for a few seconds. But somebody might get in a question like, hey, how do we know you're here? Move that hairbrush over there. And they pick something up and move it 5 feet and everybody sees it. Maybe someone's working on their phone and they pick it up on their phone. So those are post-death. So there's a number of, as you say, Twilight Zone cases in different categories.
Yeah. That happened to my grandmother when my grandfather died in the early 70s. She said that she had seen her husband at the foot of her bed. And quite honestly, for decades, even up until the time I started listening and following you and hearing you talk about NDEs, I thought, wow, that's just loony. And now, as I hear you many times talk about highly evidence cases, I try to to see what that means. What counts? What counts as evidence versus highly evidence versus, you're a little wacky.
Sure. Well, Mike, in Mike's big book on the resurrection, he has a what do you call it, Mike? A list of evidence from not very evidential to very evidential. And Mike, he's doing it historically, but he does. I think it's important to have one of those things in mind that he talks about, and he moves from not very good, decent, 50-50, getting better, and something. And logic books will do this too. This category, whatever you want to call the last one, is very evidential, and this one's highly evidential. There have been a couple people, Tim McGrew and Richard Swinburne, who have applied Bayes' theorem to these things, ways of evaluating evidence. You may or may not like Bayes' theorem, but the principle is very well accepted. And they both get in the neighborhood of 97 to 99% likelihood for the resurrection. And you can do the same thing for afterlife. So there are ways to quantify the data.
Oh, wow. That's amazing. Mike, you have anything to add?
Well, there was a lot covered right there, about soul and spirit and then evidence. And no, I'll just leave it where Gary had it.
Okay.
Mike, unless you want to say something about that little, improbable all the way to probable mechanism that you try to use, that might help the people see it's not just to guess where we are. We have to have data to, cross categories moving up.
Yeah, well, I could talk about that in two areas. So I could do that. But let me ask you something. We've got some yard work that's going on right now, right out front. It's kind of noisy. Do you hear anything? Because it's pretty noisy here. Okay. All right. Well, that's good. So this microphone is working well at, just picking up what's coming from right here. All right. So I do it in two ways. Number one, I do it with sources. So in chapter 3 of my book on the resurrection, there's only 5 chapters in it. So, but chapter 3 talks about the sources and what are our best sources for the resurrection, and then I assess them. And so it's like, well, I assess them in terms of which are most likely. What's the probability that they reflect eyewitness testimony in there? And so I look at the Gospels, I look at Paul's letters, I look at I look at the Gnostic literature, I look at the Apostolic Fathers, and I rate them according to that, which are best. So there's a spectrum of probability with that. And then in the end, so in chapters 1 and in chapter 5, chapter 1, I talk about the philosophy of history, historical method. And in chapter 5, I apply it to 6 different hypotheses. And so you weigh them the hypotheses according to how well they fill the criteria of inference to the best explanation. And then according to how well they fulfill that criteria, and by how much they distance, like a single hypothesis, the best one distances its closest competitor, will determine where you are on let's call it a spectrum of historical certainty. So if you think of, maybe like a yardstick, but take out all the numbers from it, in the middle is like a 0, meaning indeterminate. So we've got some data, but it's entirely inconclusive. It's not weighing on one side or the other. It's just indeterminate. And then if, let's say, there's a natural explanation or a competing hypothesis, let's call it, that explains, perhaps casts some doubt, or may explain the data better than the primary hypothesis, then you'd say the hypothesis, say that Jesus rose from the dead, is less probable than probable. And then you can slide down that scale to, it's like, well, we're almost certain that it did not happen. And then you can go up on a positive end, like more probable than not. Quite probable, very probable, almost certain. And then the question that historians are going to ask, well, where does a hypothesis have to fall on that spectrum of historical certainty before you adopt it and say, well, this is what probably occurred. This is probably the historical description that is correct. And historians differ on that. So you had James D.G. Dunn say, more probable than not is all you need.
Has the hard work been done in that area in NDEs, Gary?
I don't say it's been done as in it's over.
Okay.
But you know why? There are so many major researchers now. Some of the top researchers, one who just retired was the top brain researcher at the University of Virginia Medical School, an MD. Cardiologists, one major one, Jeffrey Long, is an oncologist. A lot of these guys deal with death and dying, and they are producing cases all the time. And as the editor, I'm not the editor of that journal you mentioned, but I'm one of the reviewers, one of the panel that they go to. We get we get those articles regularly. And sometimes they'll publish a whole article on one case.
Right.
That's very well documented. So yeah, they're coming in all the time. And I wrote just a few years ago and said there's over 300 cases. I'll bet you there's over 400 evidential cases now. So there's a lot.
And these are not all from Christians.
Absolutely not. No, because NDEs, like I said in my little testimony part when we started, a lot of the evidence for an afterlife is indeterminate on a worldview.
Yeah.
It can be strong evidence for an afterlife, but you get kind of okay, now where do we go? Well, I don't know, maybe one of the religions, but you don't know which one. The resurrection is super, as Mike was explaining. The resurrection is super because it is something which potentially explains the afterlife data in a particular category. And somebody could say, well, yeah, but you're just a Christian. That's what you'd say. And I'd say, well, hey, try it on. If you don't think it works, you tell me why it doesn't work. And you maybe know, Mike, that in discussions, Bart Ehrman mentions this in one of his books. He says, when I was a Christian, I would love non-Christians to pick something. Oh, I don't know. The disciples stole the body. Well, hey, can I help you with that? And there goes an hour conversation. You try to get them to, oh, there's a lot of things you could say about that. Well, then say it. Say it. Not right now. And then you think, okay, it's not as strong as you think it is.
Right.
But they can offer alternatives. So same thing with NDEs. They can offer alternatives. But I'm going to tell you something. The NDE data is like intelligent design. I think, well, I'm publishing an article in NDEs with an ID press, an intelligent design press. And I told my editor, who's a physicist, I thought I was getting pretty bold when I said this to him, but I said, I'll tell you what, I think the evidence for NDEs is as strong as the evidence for intelligent design. There's that many evidential pieces. And he didn't say a word. He thought that was apparently thought it was an okay comparison. So there's an awful lot of data, thousands of pieces.
Okay. I want to back up just a little bit with something you said earlier, and that was concerning, that it's indeterminate as far as a worldview or a religion, specifically religion. So why in these NDE experiences is there this whole compendium of reports of where they went, what kind of tunnel they went through, who they saw, whether it was within their particular religion or not?
Well, there are a lot, but and now a lay person, I think even more sophisticated than lay people would say, see, that's an argument for universalism. That's an argument for all religions go to heaven because they saw some spirit creature, let's just say an angel. They frequently report a being of light that surrounds them, and it's the most loving experience they've ever had in their life. And then therefore they interpret that positively, like I must be on their good side or I wouldn't have had that experience. So they think that. Okay, but what they don't tell you is there are 18 to 20% hell cases. So about 1/5 of the time, people have very scary negative experiences. But here's the main thing. I differentiate between NDEs that happen in this world's data, what happened in the operating room, what happened a mile away, what happened to blind people who have not seen from birth. They see and report during their NDE. It's evidential, and then they go back to not seeing again. And for the rest of their life, they can't see. But they saw for 20 minutes and reported data. There's all kind. I give 5 categories of evidential data. And
yeah, the one with the blind, that just seems the most amazing, that they could actually report, and not just describing it like maybe a radio announcer would, but perhaps seeing things that they never saw maybe, and not even understanding how to describe color.
Exactly. One of the interviews, the interviewer says to the guy, "Did you see in color or did you see in black and white?" Now, the blind person has probably heard those words, but they may not know the difference between black and white. Well, they know black and white, but what's black and white? They've never seen even that. And then what's red and blue and green? Well, so the answer the NDEer gave, pretty interesting. The NDEer said, "Well, I don't know if I was seeing in color, but I can tell you that I saw many and very vivid shades of light." That was their wording for color. Many vivid colors, but what they said was distinctions in the light patterns. So that's a long way to say I saw colors.
Right, right. Wow, how amazing is that, for sure. Now, we've talked about all the facts and the highly evidential stuff, and when I speak to my friends and just the average person who nods off when you talk about philosophy or anything else like this that excites me, I get accused of mansplaining, right? So, and see, Jackie, she's the one who did it. So she and we've gone back and forth, and I want to hear more from her a little bit on this, some questions, because we talked a lot about intuition, right? Facts, but you have this thing that that we call intuition. And before we go into it, I've honestly, in my conversations with Jackie and just trying to read, I've been trying to come up with Mike Burnett's working definition of, the value and limitations of intuition, which I see as a form of knowledge, right? So I'd like to bounce that off of you guys. And I said, intuition is a soul-endowed, subconscious glimpse of reality that is rapidly processed by our mind and progressively informed and matured by introspection and adequate knowledge. I can read. That's a lot to absorb, I know, but it seems to me that it is something that we have. I think it's endowed. I see it as a Christian person. I kind of see it as what is being talked about in Romans, where we can come to know God through our conscience, through creation, and through Christ. But I'm not sure where its limitations are. How much do you think, and Jackie, you can ask a question to follow this up. How much can we know about God and discovering truth, do you think, through intuition? Gary?
Oh, okay. I thought Jackie was going to.
Oh, go. I had a mouthful there.
I'll just make a general comment.
Mm-hmm.
Mike, I can tell you've done some philosophy, or you wouldn't have made that distinction about intuition. However, not a whole lot of philosophers, given all the philosophers out there.
Mm-hmm.
Very few of them, I would say. Bergson is an example of one who would take it seriously. But I don't think very many philosophers sit there and tell you, make a whole. It's not. I would say I have a dim view of intuition. Do we get things from time to time? Yep. Could they be true? Yep. How do they compare to, say, reason or sense data? I'd say not so well.
Mm-hmm.
And you say, well, how do you know? Well, here's the main problem. I may have an intuition about something, like what my wife is thinking before she says something, or what does X say about reality? I might have an intuition. Here's the problem. It's epistemic, which is a fancy word for how do we know it's true. I don't know. To me, there are very few checks and balances for intuition. It might be there, and it might play a role, and I might have a feeling, or I might have a conviction. But it's really hard. I would never have gone that route in my doubt days, because I would say, well, how do I know the intuition's gone? and somebody else goes, yeah, I heard Mike's description, and I had an opposite intuition. And I'd say that's the problem with intuitions. We can't decide between them.
Okay.
That's interesting. I really do find that interesting. So let me just give you a little pop-in background here. I was raised a Christian. Both my parents, they are both deceased now, were ministers. But I approached it completely different from what I've been hearing. That is where you gentlemen were talking about how it was the intellectual side that you were looking for, prove it, all of that. I always went on the emotional side. And I know that's opening myself up to a lot of those, oh, you're a girl. And I don't think you're going to do that. But let's just put it there. But you're talking about an intellectual based or an evidence-based quest to find the answers. And I respect that completely and I admire it. But if I am coming to this is my question. If I am coming to the same conclusions that the three of you gentlemen are that do a lot of studying on this, does that mean then that my intuition is flawed? If I'm coming to the exact same conclusions that you have all come to without making that an area of study for myself?
I would think, Jackie, that's a great question, but I'd say not necessarily. Let's face it. Let's just take examples. Some Muslims, and they go through an investigation, and they look at Islam intellectually, and they assess the different worldviews, and they come to the conclusion that Islam is true. Well, how much of that was really because that's where the evidence points, and they did a really good investigation? How much of it was motivated, influenced by the worldview? The same can be said about us, of course, as Christians. And then let's say the Muslim woman who lives in Saudi Arabia, she hears conversations with her husband and others on Islam. And, she goes to prayer at the mosque, and she hangs around with other Muslim women, and she's convinced, she feels like an intuition that Islam is true. So could her intuition deceive her, just as, those who are thinking and using intellect more can be deceived by their own desire to arrive at the conclusion at which they wanted, where they wanted to arrive. So, so I would say that not necessarily. I mean, some people we all believe Christianity is true, and we believe that whether through intuition or through our intellectual pursuits, we believe and we're convinced that Christianity is true. But people of other worldviews do too, and they can fail in that. Christians can become Christians because of intuition. They can become Christians because of intellect. They could become Christians just because that's the way that they were raised. You could become a Christian for all the wrong reasons, and you're still plugged into the right worldview, but that doesn't legitimize maybe the way that you became a Christian. I'm not delegitimizing intuition at all.
So that's kind of falls into the genetic fallacy area, right? It doesn't matter where you were born or how you were raised, but the truth is the truth, regardless of what you were taught or where you were lived or where you attended and those types of things. But those seem to be the types of things that we as humans are absorbing knowledge from the time we're born. That's part of my definition, where it's maturing, it's progressively, and we have things that we attach to intuition. And correct me if I'm wrong, but and my bias is as a Christian, but I really try to logic these things through to try to know why I'm believing it, why I'm moving down a certain path. Is that my logic, as I'm looking at the Quran or the Bible or the Book of Mormon or any of that stuff, is trying to take in that information and figure out through the knowledge and intuition whether or not it's consistent, whether it matches reality or not. and whether or not it's something that we want to live by, and what its limitations are. Can we make a decision based? We can't really make a lot of decisions based on the first things we learn. Right. We can't. So I kind of look at intuition as that first glimpse of, that's what I talked about, that soul endowed glimpse of reality that God maybe puts in us. I know people like Plantinga talk about properly basic beliefs, right? Can we just have that? Can that be part of that intuition, you think, whether you believe it as a Christian or not?
I'll say what I said earlier, and I would agree with the same line of reasoning that Mike just said.
Mm-hmm.
Probably the great majority of Christians that I know, including my present wife, my deceased wife, mother of my 4 children, my great-grandmother, who I started this program talking about, my grandparents, both my parents, most of those are women. A couple of them are men. And all of them are not bothered. My wife, my present wife, is not the slightest bit moved when someone gives an argument against Christianity that she can't get to first base explaining. She goes, well,
talk to my husband.
That's your view. But she's absolutely sure. And I've talked to her enough. We've been married for 26 years. Mm-hmm. And I have asked her a number of times, when that person's asking that, do you really feel any doubts at all? Nope. Yeah. When someone's given the strongest evidence you ever heard for the resurrection, does your faith get stronger?
No.
Maybe a little, but I didn't need it. And that's the phrase I always hear. I didn't need it. And people like Bill Craig and Alvin Plantinga, you mentioned him. Mm-hmm. They've done a fair amount with this properly basic truth. And what does Romans 1 and 2 mean when it says God's made himself knowable through 2 things, through nature, what we might really beef up as intelligent design and so on. Mm-hmm. And secondly, through our consciences, which we may beef up as kind of a moral argument for God's existence. And Paul says, therefore, we're without excuse. But they don't even go into that much reasoning. They just say that has been instilled in us. Al Plantinga would say, we are as sure of God as we are of other persons. A famous problem in philosophy is we don't know that, as far as I'm concerned, the 3 of you may not exist. And for you, the other 3 may not exist. It's an insuperable problem in mm-hmm. philosophy that you can't show other minds exist. But they're probable. It doesn't bother anybody too much. Well, that God's existence is going to be assured to us. And so not only do I not have a problem with people who think like that, many, 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 many times in my life I've said, I wished I could be like that. It would make life a lot simpler. Of course, I wouldn't be an apologist. I'd be doing something else. And I love apologetics. But anyway, I don't ever question them. I'll say, how do you know it's true? And they'll just flatly say to me, I couldn't care less. I know it's true. I don't have to reason it. Not sure I could, but I know it's true.
Well, isn't that where? Well, and I get that, and I feel like at this stage of my life, I know certain things. I know that it's true as well, and humbly, without 100% certainty, as some philosophers say. But you can have that. You can, like one of the guys that you mentioned in another interview, I think, who saw his wife and believed it, or had some type of experience and believed it, but there was no way of him convincing someone else that it happened.
Sure.
Right. But when you become an apologist or you become a professor, and it's great that you can sit there and say, hey, I know this. And if you're right, that's great. If you're right, it's great. But how do you go about, convincing others, which, in the Christian worldview, that's kind of that's the Great Commission, right? To go forward and to preach and teach and to tell people about Jesus Christ. It's something that all Christians are called to do. Well, therein lies the rub. You have to know something. You have to know something. You can't just go, hey, you know what? I got this thing, and let me stand over next to you and maybe it'll rub off. Right?
You know, Mike, I think some of it is it's kind of like the love languages, 5 love languages. I'm convinced over the years that there are truth languages. And what led me to that is, you know, I'm one that I got to have evidence. That means everything to me. I don't care if it works for you, because it can work for various systems, can work for different people. I want to know if it's true. And so I have to look at evidence, but not everybody's that way. And I remember there was a physician that I knew who was in the Navy, and she was seeking, and I provide all these kinds of arguments and things, and she'd listen, and it's like, well, that's kind of neat. But what ultimately meant the most to her was traditions. She didn't want to go to a seeker church. She wanted to go to a high church, and that's what spoke to her. And it's like, wow, well, that's kind of interesting. And, you know, Mark Middleburg has written a book on this. And I forgot what it's called now. It's the revised version, and it just came out, I think, last year. So you check out Mark Middleburg in a book, and he talks about different ways that people receive the truth of the gospel. And so just as there are different love languages, I think there's some different truth languages, and arguing for apologetics isn't going to always help. I watched Jackie's face when Gary said some people aren't at all going to be encouraged, or their belief is not going to be strengthened by evidence for the resurrection. And it seemed like that really resonated with Jackie. And so that just convinces me all the more. There are different kinds of truth languages, and apologetics doesn't work for all people. It's not a one size fits all thing.
Gotcha.
I'll add though, but back to Mike's improbable all the way to probable yardstick. If I'm talking to Jackie and she confirms what Mike just said, and she says, well, for me, it's like this, and I don't need this and that. My wife, my mother, I don't try to convince them they're not thinking straight and they need evidences. And if you had 10 evidences, you'd be much more convinced of Christianity. And I don't do that at all.
Right.
I think there are different strokes for different folks. And as major an apologist as Bill Craig, William Lane Craig, he starts out in an earlier edition of one of his very well-known books. He's on the resurrection. Well, it's on the general apologetics, but he starts at the beginning and he says, there are 2 ways to know this truth, the truth of this argument. One is by throwing your hat into the circle of history. And when you let history be your guide, you cannot get stronger data than history can give, because if you've chosen to use history, you must use the data of history. But on the other side, and he's maybe talking about something like Plantinga, on the other side, there are deep convictions, and Mike, you might say intuitions, very deep convictions that there's a God, and you're not moved with people telling you different things. And so his conclusion at the beginning of this book is, there's 2 ways, for example, you can know the resurrection of Jesus occurred. One is an internal conviction, a God-given conviction. And of course, that might be the Holy Spirit of Romans 8. It might be God manifesting himself in nature of Romans 1 and 2. But Bill says, if you come to that through your own private message, as Mike said, you're right. You might not be able to quantify it, but you're right. But if you need evidence, it's that too. And that's what I would add at the end. The heavy stuff in Christianity is there. Just the briefest comment here. I don't think that if anybody tries to apply the data for the books of the New Testament to the books of any other major religion, there are gaps in the other religions that are amazing, up to 4,000 years between the Holy Book and when certain other religions occurred. And when you debate somebody, they'll do this. One guy actually said, yeah, I can't believe your resurrection thing because that would make me believe Buddha's miracles. Really? So you're not going to believe the resurrection with reports immediately after the event, but you're going to accept Buddha where the earliest miracle accounts are 600, 800 years later. And that doesn't bother you at all. So I'm just glad the evidence is there for people who want it. Now, if Jackie says, wow, that helps me. I mean, I'm glad to know that, but I'm still where I am. I didn't need it. I respect that. I mean, it's my own wife. It's my own mother. I respect it mightily. I would never, ever try to move a person like that or tell them they need to learn more, they need to get smarter, or they need to go study history or philosophy. Never,
Right.
ever do it. I like what Mike says about different strokes for different folks and the epistemic love language. I think that's a great concept.
Those gaps that you mentioned are those gaps are the things that legend and myths drive into, right? As far as see Muhammad being or the Quran being written 600 years, is it Mike or Gary after Muhammad and
No, 600 years after Jesus.
after Jesus, right.
Almost
So that reports
To the
things
year.
that are 600 years past the fact. You have to
Yeah.
wonder how credible it is, whereas the gospel falls into a different category, right?
Yeah, I think what I think the other Mike Lacone is saying is the Quran is exactly 600 years after the crucifixion. It's 30-ish AD, 630-ish AD.
Mm-hmm.
So their commenting on Christianity is not too reliable. In fact,
Right.
a Muslim scholar says, when any Christian says to me, you can't tell me Jesus didn't die on the cross because your holy book says so. Your holy book is 600 years late. That's lousy history. The Muslim scholar says, you're right. I'm going, what? The scholar says, you're right. It's not good history. But then I try to change the subject to another field and go after the Christian. But he's already conceded the point that his source is not very good on Christianity.
Yeah.
So,
Well, in my life, whether it is getting people to put down my new wood floors or a mechanic or knowing about religion, I like to go to authorities. I like to look for the authority. Like Mike made the reference to the inference to the best explanation, right, Mike? And that falls into a bunch of different categories: explanatory scope, explanatory power, ad hoc, and a few others, right? So that we have all these tools at our disposal in life for, philosophy is great because it can help you like logic your way through a lot of discussions and things at work or religion or whatever. And that's why I love it so much. But I want to give Jackie a last opportunity to follow up on intuition here, if she has any.
No, I just, the only thing I was thinking when you were just speaking, Mike Burnett, was,
Call me
well,
Moondog. It's
if we
okay.
had- what was that?
You can go with Moondog.
All I was thinking of was, wow, when we actually worked together and we were in the same location, this would have been a fascinating discussion because just as Gary said, I honestly, truly do not need any type of intellectual or evidential proof to convince me of what I believe is true.
Yeah.
And that's where I am. The same kind of plane that your wife is on there.
Yeah.
But I do find it interesting. You guys have really given me some things to think about, though, I'll be very honest. And Gary, I did, in preparation for today, buy your book. So I will be reading that.
Oh.
And I've been jotting down notes of different sources to look at. Do I need those sources? No, but I am interested in seeing it through your eyes, if that makes sense.
Sure. Hey, Mike, if I could say something before the show is over, you raised something earlier that I do a lot of work with doubters, and a few books on it. I could see something causing some consternation for some of your listeners, and I want to explain something. You asked me a question, and I didn't answer it at the time. You were saying, what about NDEs that give all this other religious data? And I use the example of, they'll say an angel, but they'll feel like they were affirmed in their religion, and somebody else will feel affirmed in their religion. And so some people say, see, NDEs prove universalism. Just one principle that kind of brings that to naught. When I do NDEs, I'm like Mike Lacone. I am not moved by many things. I'm not talking about loving my kids and my grandkids. I'm talking about things that comprise my worldview. I'm not moved by things that are not evidential. And if you tell me something, well, the angel accepted me, so my Buddhism must be correct. I'd say, how do you know? How do you know that? That's an inference that you make. You felt accepted, therefore your religion is true. I mean, that sounds kind of faulty as logic. So the rule I use is this. When someone presents data for the NDE, I'm all ears. But virtually all the data are this worldly. It's the event that happened down the hall in the hospital, 7 floors away, back in their home, 2 miles away from the hospital. And these cases are extremely evidential that they were able to look in and see that with no heart and no brain activity, as far as we can tell. But the ones in heaven, quote unquote, when they see something that's evidential and then they zip off to heaven, you can't show me you were with an angel. You surely cannot show me that that angel's loving you meant you were going to that heaven. And you go, well, yeah, that's just your way of going after other religions. Not true. I say the same thing about Christian experiences. I was with Jesus, and Jesus made me feel I was going to be back here someday. That's great. Like I said to Jackie, I'm not going to argue with that, but I don't think it's evidential. And someone else goes, well, I'll bet you accept the hell cases because that works out with your worldview. I don't accept the quote unquote heavenly experiences without data. And 99% of them have no data. So I can listen to a testimony. I won't know that testimony is true. So what can I talk about? I can talk about the evidential ones, and I can talk about an afterlife, but I do not embrace, I'll listen. They're very good stories, but I won't embrace those heavenly type things, whether they're Christian or non-Christian. I'm an equal opportunity, not just doubter. I'm an equal opportunity rejecter. And I'll say this one last statement. They could be true. We don't know what God's got for people or what people have done in their hearts. We don't know. We're not the judges of the universe. They could be true. The catch is I don't know they're true. Right. And if I don't know they're true, I cannot hang a worldview on data I cannot quantify. Now, Jackie can say, well, I feel this. And you know what, Jackie, my wife's like that. My mother's like that. And I just smile, and I would never, ever argue. I'm happy. I'm genuinely happy for their assurance.
Yeah.
And close to working with me.
Gary, I've been married for 40 years, so I usually smile as well. And my wife is very much like that too. But inside, I'm going, well, you need all this evidence for the ingredients you bake for your pies and your cakes. You need all this stuff that, for recipes and the things. It applies to almost every other part of her life.
Yep.
Every part of her life involves some form of evidence. And that's the stone in my shoe. The thing that bugs me is like, okay, you demand all this evidence on every aspect of your life, but when it comes to religion and God, you go, I don't really need that.
How about this, Mike? If your child is sick, now this is a mom more than a dad, I would say from experience, not trying to be pejorative, but if your child is sick and you need antibiotics right away, or you need to go to the emergency room, guess what? All of a sudden, mom needs evidence.
Yep.
She says, why A and not B on the sickness? And why A and not B on the drug you're given? And just to be sure, why don't we give both drugs because they don't conflict? And I want my child well in a few days. They've got this and that and this and that, and I've got this and that. And more importantly, I care about their life. On the real important things, we ask for data. Now, I'm not saying religion is not important to people. I'm just saying even a person who says I don't need those reasons when it comes to their children, for example, grandchildren, data are required. That's why we go to a doctor. We don't ask the mailman about why my daughter has a sore throat.
Right. We're certainly not relativistic about whether we're taking poison versus good medicine. And I know we're starting to get toward the end. We ran a little bit late, so I'd still have a couple of questions I'd like to ask, if that's okay. Because I want to move into reincarnation for a couple minutes.
Listen, I do have to go, so I'm going to check out and let Gary deal with that. Okay. So great. Thanks for letting me join. Good to be with you guys.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mike. Unless you have to go, Gary, I would kind of like to ask you at least one or two questions.
Sure. I'm okay. Reincarnation. Yep.
Okay. So in talking about reincarnation, you talked about, you're not the judge of the universe, and we're not the judges of the universe. But in reincarnation, and aspects of pantheism or panentheism or panpsychism, who's the judge of the universe?
Who is? Well, ultimately, God is, if there's a God. Now, if you don't think there's a God, you're going to have to tangle with all the data I'm going to bring. But God is the judge. I'm not. The way I often say it is, God did not, in Jesus' parable, God did not tap me on the shoulder and say, you're the one who separates the wheat from the tares.
Yeah.
That's not my job.
Okay, so but within the worldview of, say, a Buddhist or a Hindu or someone who believes in reincarnation and who doesn't necessarily believe in a divine almighty God of Scripture like a Christian or a Jew does, how do you? Because it seems like to me, in the limited knowledge I have, that's more. It falls into materialism and some of the things that come out of the New Age offshoots that various, pagan religions embrace. How do you think that would impact or stand up? How do you think it stands up against the Christian worldview?
Not well, and on the same grounds I've been setting out in the book, the same book that Jackie interestingly held up, Beyond Death, that I co-authored with J.P. Moreland. I've got a chapter on reincarnation, and I'd have to go back and look. I try to be fair. I think I give at least 5 arguments in favor of reincarnation, and then I start giving critiques, and I break the critiques into a knockout critique that by itself really questions it, then 2 more that are really strong, and then a bunch that have additional qualifications that make me doubt. The major for me, and if you don't like number 1, I think I'm close to 20 objections in that chapter. I'd have to go back and look. But here's the major point. The number 1 reincarnation scholar in the world until his death was a medical doctor, a psychiatrist at University of Virginia, and his name was Ian Stevenson. He wrote several books on reincarnation, and they were published majorly. I mean, the University of Virginia published a book, 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation. And by the way, I appreciate his title, suggestive. He's not trying to say he can prove it. But in that book, he says, there's one other hypothesis besides reincarnation that is a rival to reincarnation on the same, as I said, up to 5 or more arguments for reincarnation. There's another rival hypothesis, and Christians would have to grab their chair at this point because he's going to come into our world, or other religions too have this concept. But he said possession can explain all the same data. Possession. And now when you say possession, there are 2 kinds of, there's semi-points, but there are 2 kinds of possession in this data. One is possession by an unfriendly spirit. Sometimes in the literature, they even say things like demons or things like that. But the second kind of possession, Christians don't talk about too much, but it's called discarnate possession. And that is, let me give you an example rather than definition. Let me define by example. Person A dies, and 10 years after their death, a child B is born. Discarnate possession is that the human spirit of the deceased person enters the child that was born years later. And the knowledge that the child has of, well, I used to live in that house over there, and I can tell you where my bedroom was. You go down the hallway, and it's the last room on the left. How'd you know that? I just know it. Well, in either case, a demon could know that, or a discarnate human individual who used to live in that house would know where the bedroom was. And Stevenson goes on to say, these two hypotheses are pretty powerful, and each giving offers on which view to take. He says, but I think reincarnation is better. Now, I think he's leaning to his worldview there. Like Mike said, Christians do that too. We lean to our worldview. And he says, I think it's reincarnation. But there are other reincarnation experts and scholars who believe in reincarnation who say, yeah, I don't think it's 50-50. I think it is demon possession. And they go with the possession thesis. All I'm saying is that reason alone is quite an incredible comeback. Now, let's ask the question, where are almost all reincarnation cases? I shouldn't say all, but the great majority of them are somewhere between, let's say, Lebanon and China. They're somewhere in a straight line across that part of the world. They're especially in India, cases like Tibet, especially in those cases where Hinduism and maybe Buddhism are the major religions. And often, like Jackie was saying, those people accept their religions without evidence too.
Right.
But they're buoyed up because they think there's some evidence for reincarnation. If there's evidence for, some of them will say, well, there's reincarnation in Christianity too. I don't think there's much chance of that, but that's their thesis. But they're trying to say, here's an area where we might have some evidence for our religion. And my first comeback would be, not if this is equally explainable not by the Christian concept of demon possession, but the world religious concept of demon possession. It's in almost every religion there is. Yeah. And that's just one. That's just one comeback. I'll be glad to give you a couple others. Yeah. But I think possession, if I could give a naturalistic theory for the resurrection, and it's equal to the resurrection in an explanatory value, I would start having some doubts again about the resurrection. The fact that there's nothing out there like that is evidenced by the fact that no critic takes any view like this. An atheist New Testament scholar who has an axe to grind against Christianity.
Wouldn't you also, Gary, look at the methodology of Dr. Stevenson? It seems from what I've read that he interviewed people through translators and their parents who might have even been looking for payoffs, and that they could have answered for their children in wrong kinds of ways.
Well, that's a second. If I were to give a list of critiques, that's my second one. One philosopher, a skeptical philosopher, not a Christian as far as I know, says this. He goes, there's a little rule I use with reincarnation, and it goes like this. If the researcher could find the data that the child is true, why couldn't somebody else have known that data, told the child, and now the child has a memory in their mind of being in that house and going down the hallway to the left when they've never been in that home? In other words, if I can discover the data, somebody else could have told the child that data because they discovered it. And my point about especially India and Tibet and so on, Hindu and Buddhist cultures, the thing is, I produce, in that chapter that in the book Jackie was holding up, I produce a quote from a former Indian guru. He was higher up than the normal gurus. In fact, his dad was thought to be like, I don't want to say reincarnation, but an avatar in the Hindu faith, his dad. And he grew up with a dad in the house. And he makes a comment that I quote in that book where he says, the Hindu world is filled with the occult and with drugs and with dabbling in the netherworld. And so therefore, as I was raised, he said, in the Hindu religion, he came to reject it. But he said, as I was raised in the Hindu world, I had to give my due diligence to the spirit world, including demons and false spirits. So I don't know why most of you go, well, Stevenson found some testimonies in Alaska. Yeah, among Native Americans of the, up north.
Right.
Or he's got a case from South Africa. Yeah, but the person he's got the case from is Indian. I mean, it's not a cultural thing. It's not oh, you're an Indian, that's bad. I'm not saying that. I'm saying it's a culture that brings in all kinds of other things. And if this former guru is correct, and you're bringing drugs and forget the drugs, if you're bringing the occult into your religion and you have to do your due, he literally says, I had to do my due diligence to these foreign spirits. I had to recognize them too in my Indian religion. I really wonder where the data is coming from, and if the number one alternative subject is possession, then I've got to wonder if you were kind of setting yourself up for that kind of thing ahead of time by your own worldview. So, so like I said, I give about 20 critiques. Anybody can read that chapter on reincarnation of the book Beyond Death, with J.P. Warner and myself. But I think that there are enough comebacks. They do have some really interesting data they support. I give 5 different kinds, but there's no reason somebody else couldn't know the same thing. And besides, does the demon know? Does a potential demon know? Or discarnate possession? Does the deceased, the person with the deceased spirit? And some Christians are going to say, I don't think deceased persons can inhabit other persons. And my response to that is, as Christians, we are too far boxed up where we think we know what goes on 1 minute after you die or 5 minutes after you die. We don't know what's there. And why couldn't God? I mean, I have no problem saying a guy who died, his spirit could affect a kid. And don't forget, there's such a difference between possession. There's also oppression, where the person can influence but not possess.
Right.
I don't know why God wouldn't. God allows demons to do this. Why wouldn't you? Well, because they're disobedient. That's my point. If demons can do it, why couldn't a former? So I think it's an incredible critique, because if that's their biggest evidence they've got going, I wouldn't put it up against the resurrection.
Well, Gary, within reincarnation, maybe this is a way. We have been discussing, Jackie and I, for a while, soul contracts, and even having a whole program on soul contracts. And for those who don't know, they believe that the soul contracts are the reason that we find ourselves in the situations that we're in now, that our personal misfortunes are fated in pre-birth plans and contracts, which souls supposedly create to accelerate growth in an upcoming incarnation. And through karma, we're supposed to be punished and or matured back into the divine goodness and oneness of the universe as our consciousness develops.
Right. And one more time, I would say that's really nice if you want to believe that. I don't mean you, but if you want to believe that, great, but no data. That's a nice little theory that's not grounded. And even reincarnation, which is the best grounded thing I know of in an Eastern type religion, if it can't explain the two different kinds of possession, I think it's in great need of saying that my religion is true because of it. And the fact that most of the adherents, most of Ian Stevenson's cases were Indian and Tibetan and so on, that makes me question it, because that's the culture, according to this former guru, that's the culture that fosters this and encourages the very things that I think are a good alternate explanation.
Yeah, it makes me wonder about the certainly isn't the inference to the best explanation when it comes to the nature of God, in my opinion, because our moral duties aren't grounded. Moral duties and responsibilities don't appear to me to be grounded, and you got to wonder, how does this universe that is supposedly half good and half bad and needs to improve, how does that count as God? It seems like a very, I tried to, you said earlier, I've had some philosophy training. Yeah, you trained me some in 1979 in one of your classes.
Right.
A lot of years ago. But I was thinking about, the Euthyphro dilemma.
Right.
And I was wondering about how to apply that, toward, reincarnation, or the whole nature of the universe. And I said something like this: is something good because the universe wills it, which is arbitrary, or does the universe will it because it's good? That means that the good would be independent of God. And then what does that tell us about the universe? How could the universe even do such a thing or be a standard of good?
Yeah, and I'm going to give the standard response to Euthyphro dilemma too, and I'm going to say classic Christianity whether it's Augustine, which is of a Platonic interpretation, or a Thomas Aquinas, which is Aristotelian, and you're going back now to the two fathers, Greek fathers of so much philosophy in the world. Both of them are going to say God can only be God. God can't die. God can't lie. God can't kill himself. God can't pass out of existence. He can't tempt you with evil. There's a whole lot of things God can't do. He cannot do contradictory things. God cannot make square circles or unmarried husbands. And in a universe like that, where it makes sense, one of the three reasons Anthony Flew became a theist was because the laws of nature always work. 2 + 2 is always 4.
Yeah.
God's got some laws there. And I would say, agreeing with Augustine and Thomas, God acts according to his nature. You act according to your nature. Jackie acts according to her nature. I act according to my nature. We can only do, now human beings are we're mixed up people. We can act outside our nature, but God can't. And I don't think God, my answer is God acted out of his nature, and then you a problem. So no, it does. That is not boss over God. It's the other options that say something that it leaves God not the head of the universe here, I think are just silly. God acted out of his own nature. And to me, I got a buddy who did his whole dissertation, did a PhD dissertation in philosophy for an atheist philosophy department at a secular university. He did his whole dissertation on the unibrow thing. And I think that's the major response. God's acting out of who he is. But see, and you go, well, that's your God. No, that's the God of intelligent design, moral argument, fine tuning, the Kalam argument, and I would say the God of the resurrection argument, which I use most of all. And all of those things say that God can't do those silly things. And so don't just say what if. I don't mean you, but what if God did this? That's great, but he can't act like that. And Augustine agrees with Thomas, and they come from major different schools of thought. So I don't have any issue whatsoever. Youth to throw doesn't even make me pause.
Right. So when we talk about God, we talk of in philosophy terms, we think of God as a necessary being, right? So that the universe from a pantheistic view and everything that falls down under it with New Age ways of thinking or naturalistic ideas, naturalism that touches a lot of offshoots of paganism are not necessary. The only thing that is necessary, and you can maybe give a better definition of necessary and what that means as it applies to God.
Yeah, well, I'll tell you what, let me use a sentence by C.S. Lewis. And that's the problem with a lot of these things you just mentioned. Lewis says, if there ever was a time when nothing existed, nothing would exist now. Necessary existence is something that's a very rare concept. No humans, no finite beings can fulfill this. A necessary being is someone, or in the case of, you say, pantheism, something, because pantheism is not usually called a theism. But there had to be a beginning. You go, well, the universe is like 14 billion years old, someone says, or whatever. Okay, and you go, well, what was before that? And they go, there's no before. Time came at that time. And I go, well, look, at whatever word you use, you know what I'm asking? If it's quote unquote only 14 billion years old, how did it get here? And that's the cosmological problem that's why atheists today, and not only atheists, but that's why a lot of people are saying, oh, well, there are alternate universes in it. But all that does is move the thing back several, zillion years. You still have to come at the beginning. So I think the Christian worldview meets all these checks and balances. And I think really, I started the program out by saying when my doubts subsided, like in 1990, 1992, my wife died in 95. I think that's why my doubts don't come back anymore. I don't have this kind of mythical notebook, but if I had a notebook with Kalam argument, all the evidences, moral argument, all the evidences, intelligent design, all the evidences, near-death experiences, all the evidences for an afterlife, resurrection, all the evidences for Jesus. Today, the vast majority, I've even heard critics say 100%. Now, that's not true, but they're trying to make a point. Virtually all New Testament scholars today, atheists, agnostics, They believe Jesus was a healer and an exorcist. Now, they may not believe in demons, but what they're saying is the examples given in the Gospels either occurred or something like them occurred. So Jesus is a healer. Here's another one. He predicted his resurrection ahead of time. Okay, a resurrection is great, but what about predicting that event ahead of time? One famous philosopher of science, non-Christian as far as I know, but huge name, he said, an event is one thing. Predicting the event ahead of time is something else. And that's why chemistry is such a great science. You can predict what happens when you mix chemicals together. And that's confirmatory. Well, Jesus predicted his resurrection ahead of time, and then it happened. Here's why it's important to me, Mike. That means Jesus was a common word today. That means Jesus was a player in what kind of worldview this is. If Jesus knew he was rising from the dead, then before it happened, everybody goes, that's funny. That doesn't happen. And even the disciples made fun of him, and Jesus said, get behind me, Satan. Jesus predicted. So that's another major thing. And if Jesus knew about it ahead of time, it's another point for the Christian worldview.
Sure, and not predicted in a Nostradamus kind of way, right? Just,
yeah, that general kind of, it could be Hitler, it could be Mussolini, it could be, to go back to some of the Christian books of those days, it could be Henry Kissinger, it could be anybody, you name them. And when the new guy comes on the scene, oh yeah, that's what Nostradamus meant. Yeah, those kind of amorphous type predictions.
Let's take all the letters together and add it up to 666 and figure out what the name is and all that kind of shell game stuff.
Yeah. Which is a joke, because you can't, that's what people do when they don't know the languages.
Yeah, Jackie, any questions? And you read that whole book. I know you slept with that book, so I know you're itching to ask a question. I have one last question.
No, Mike, go right ahead. Go ahead and ask your last question, because
and while you're asking, Mike, she's going to finish the last 20 pages that she hasn't gotten to yet.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Jackie. Well, whenever I read your books or any of you guys, it usually looks like a coloring book, and I have to read it. A coloring book, because I'm highlighting it. So
highlighting different colors.
And I usually have to read your books about 5 times, you and JP Moreland, before I start to understand about a third of it. So, but it's great. It's really wonderful work. I only kid, because you put it down in really good language that I think most people can understand. That's what I appreciate about your ministry. Halloween is coming up. All right. And a lot of folks, Christians and non-Christians, are having fun celebrating it. I did as a kid. I honestly struggled with that when I was younger. I had a lot of Christians tell me not to do it. It's evil, Satan's there, and the boogeyman's going to get you, and all this kind of stuff. And I kind of came to a point where I thought, okay, this is not everything about this is bad. And it's Halloween. It's the eve before Reformation Day, where we celebrate all the saints, is how, of history is how I've heard it. But there's a lot of people at this time that probably use it as a time of spiritualism, to talk to mediums, or mediums use mediums to talk with the dead, and using good magic or bad magic or whatever, universal energy that comes out of the whole idea, I guess, of pantheism, of the way the world is created in the name of religion. And there's a lot of Christians who buy into reincarnation and pagan rituals of one type of another. But the biggest one of all, Samhain, I guess that's how you say it, or the witches call it Samhain Eve on October 31st. It's one of the biggest festivals in a time of remembering their lost loved ones, and a celebration of summer's death and winter's birth. That's from my research, right? Yeah. So what is your? I mean, I kind of get from what you've already said to some degree, but just in relation to this holiday and this celebration and the way people are doing it, do you think that this is something that Christians should buy into and celebrate?
First of all, let me say, anything I say on this question is subject to reinterpretation by somebody else in their own family and how they do it. So don't take this as the gospel truth. But here's my angle. We love Halloween in our family. All the kids come over. We have 16 grandkids, and they all live in our city. Cool. And it was really incredible. Three of our ladies, two daughters and an in-law, have 12 of the 16 between them. So they're all just close here. We all come over for the donuts and cider after they've gone around the neighborhood. And this will kill you maybe. And we sit down, and it's very well known in our family, but we watch The Legend of Sleepy Hollow, which is kind of a spooky tale. All right. But here's how we try to do it. We try to redeem Halloween. A lot of people do not realize that All Saints Day is at the same time as Halloween. So in the in the medieval and so on, Reformation times, All Saints Day is a Christian holiday that happens the same time as, what do you want to say? Is Halloween the devil's holiday? I mean, that's pretty strong. But I mean, if people say that, there's a Christian one at that same time. So why not give a Christian interpretation to what you're doing? They're both there together. I saw an advertisement days ago that said, it may not even been religious, but it said, a new tradition in Halloween. People are giving out Easter eggs. Now, I don't think Easter eggs is Christian, right? I don't celebrate the Easter bunny and the goddess of God or of fertility during resurrection season. But the point is, somebody's trying to redeem Halloween with another tradition. And so we tell our kids, there's nothing about that. It's about this. And this is how we do it. James chapter 4 talks about moving away from the forces of the other forces and moving toward God. And those who turn from Satan to God, God will acknowledge that and they can move on with God. To me, it's which way you're turning. And we try to redeem the holiday to be a family day where we can celebrate our Creator. And I like that Easter egg idea, even though I hate Easter eggs and I hate rabbits. They're messing with my favorite holiday, Easter. Even if we call it Easter, that's slanted toward ancient, religion.
Right.
But they're messing with my holiday. But I like the idea of passing out Easter eggs because they're trying to say it's not this, it's this. Let's let another holiday. Let's talk about Easter at Halloween. And I like that kind of exchange.
Yeah. Well, Gary, redemption is really the operative word, isn't it? Because pagan rituals are pre-Christian.
Sure they are.
They're not pre-Hebrew. They might be closely tied to the beginning of the world, but
they were thousands of years before Christianity. Of course, so is the Old Testament.
So I mean, I from what I understand is that the word redemption is, it's how Christians have approached evangelizing the world and redeeming those times like Reformation Day. And even at Christmas time, I don't know the full history, but even Christians chose a time around Saturnalia, right? When they worship the sun god in the same window of time to redeem that holiday, that time of festivals for Christians, right? Time to redeem that holiday and to espouse the gospel.
Yeah, I mean, in our church, we have for years gone to church on Christmas Eve. And it's mostly a worship experiential service we all enjoy. And at the end of the service, they pass candles out. And we light the candles and it spreads around the room, one candle to another. And pretty soon it's like at a ball game or a rock concert where everybody's holding their phones up. Pretty soon, everybody's got a candle in the sanctuaries in the dark, but the whole sanctuary changes from dark to light. And I think that's a meaningful exchange. And we go away thinking, all right, we're 3 hours away from Christmas morning at 12 o'clock, right? 12:01. We're 3 hours away from Christmas, but we showed where our allegiance was by going to the church that evening and celebrating. And same thing on Christmas Day. We say, yeah, this was a pagan holiday, but Jesus was born someday. We had to pick a day. I mean, now we know that Easter falls in the spring. We know that. We know we're very close on the Easter date. And even a lot of critics will give you dates that are within a week of when we celebrate Easter. Christmas, we do not know when Jesus was born, but he was born. So what are we going to do? Not talk about his birth anymore because somebody says it could be Christmas? Let's just say it's not Christmas. He's not born on December 25th. That's pagan, but let's redeem it. And I don't know that's why I said, I don't know if this is the best answer. Some parents could listen to me and say, no, you're drinking it the wrong well. And that's fair. I respect their view. And if they don't have a tree and they don't have Halloween and they don't pass out candy and they turn the lights off when the kids come by, that's their business.
Right. I know some Christians who don't celebrate Christmas at Christmas because of the pagan roots and actually the commercialism, that type of.
What a great time to tell our kids, number one, materialism's wrong. And number two, there's no grounds for these non-Christian views. And I'm going to tell you something. I'm doing a major work on the resurrection right now. It's already under contract. Volume 1 is in. I've got till January to do volume 2. It's 5,500 pages on the resurrection. And 150 of those pages in volume 1, it's on the topic you're talking about, because I entertain the objection that Christianity borrowed the resurrection from pagan, non-existing mythologies like Hercules or people who largely never lived. And the idea is, you Christians didn't want to be left out. So you said, our God was raised too, even though these other gods are mythical and Christianity is historical. Well, I did 150 pages with the guys in the field. You have to do the stuff with the guys in the field and not listen to the guys on the corner who read Wikipedia. I'm not saying Wikipedia is horrible. I go there for information when I'm in a hurry too, but that can't be your major source for information. And you don't read comic books, even Christian comic books, to get your evidence on the resurrection, which some comic books do. You got to read the sources. And when you go to the sources, it is a wipeout to say that these pagan religions spread Christianity. In fact, today, Bart Ehrman, the atheist New Testament scholar, he goes off on that view for about 20 pages. And he says it is a joke. He says nobody thinks pagan religion was the reason why Peter was saying Jesus appeared to me. You have to make sense of that. And Christians have data. Those other things are stories in space that are not grounded. And again, it's the same theme I've been hitting this entire show. Is the view grounded or is it not grounded? And if it's not grounded, don't get upset with me for not buying the theory that's not grounded.
Are things quoted from movies like Zeitgeist?
Absolutely. Oh, now that was, don't get me started. On the data, that's an example of what if this, and look at that, and look at that star. That's this one, and that's the bear, and that's Orion. Okay, I hear you. What are you going to do now? You're going to build a religion on that? I mean, that's a real heavily evidenced religion. It's a joke. It's a joke. Almost every religion is a joke when it comes to producing data. And most people, I'm not trying to ride my high horse again, but most people in other religions, they don't have any data to produce. And if they say, well, but I still believe it's true, I'll say, hey, that's your business. That's your business. But as for me and my house, there's a sign right here over my table. As for me and my house, I'll pervert that verse in Joshua. For me and my house, we'll seek the evidence and follow it to the end. And I think that's what Paul was doing in 1 Corinthians 15 on the resurrection.
Yeah, I wanted to mention that here at the end, your magnum opus. You said 500 and some pages on the resurrection. But it's much bigger than that, isn't it?
5,500 pages.
5,500. Oh, okay, yes.
And the publisher, Broadman Holman Academic, is bringing it out in 4 volumes. And if any listeners know what Kittle's Kittle's New Testament of German words, and Jackie, I'm German, so I'm, and so is Mike's wife, by the way, Mike Lacona. I can appreciate this, but there's a 10-volume set of works, and each one, if you can see my hands here, each volume is about that thick, and there's 10 of them. It occupies a whole shelf behind my desk. The 4 volumes on resurrection, I measured them. I got the measuring tape. When they told me what the volumes would be, I found 4 volumes of Kittle and measured them. And these 4 volumes are going to be about a foot long of hardcover books, 4 of them.
So,
and the pages they're projecting are something like 1100, 900, 800, and 750 for the 4 volumes. So if you take the big resurrection books, I'm not trying to say mine's big so it's better. I'm not saying that at all. But the well-known resurrection, Mike's got the best book, Mike Lacona has the best book out there on the evidence now, 750 pages from InterVarsity. Well, these are 4 volumes where the smallest one is that size. I'm not, please, if Mike were here, he'd say, Doc, I know what you're saying. I am not saying bigger is better just because it's bigger. That's baloney.
Right. I don't think any of us are taking it that way.
Oh,
I've known of you and read your stuff for years. I know you write what is valuable, and you take us from the hot dogs of intuition to that full steak of the facts there. I'm Mr. Analogy Guy today.
That's okay.
All right. So any last questions for Dr. Habermas, Jackie?
No, I am good. Thank you. And thank you so much, Dr. Habermas, for not making fun of my purely emotion-based certainty.
Jackie, not only do I not make fun of it, I have told my mother, my deceased wife, my current wife, I tell everybody who holds that view, I am so happy for you. I'm so happy for your groundedness. Whatever you grounded on, like Mike said, that view can be right. And Alvin Plantinga, and a very sophisticated, nobody more sophisticated than Alvin Plantinga as a philosopher, would say, Jackie, you might not have 10 reasons, but God made creation for you to be grounded in that. And not just God, nature and conscience, Romans 1 and 2, but throw in there the book of Ecclesiastes, where God has placed eternity in every person's heart. Bertrand Russell, the famous atheist/agnostic, said there are 2 things that atheists cannot buy: God and an afterlife. And if we have a lot of evidence for both, we're very far on our way to a Christian worldview. And Plantinga says, Jackie, he's very sophisticated. Plantinga says you are within good reason to make that conclusion. Not because you can't give 10 reasons. That's not the reason. The reason it was placed in you and you cannot deny it because it's part of you. And that's a worthwhile, that's not an evidence, but I think of evidence as empirical. That's a rational consideration. We believe a lot of things that are rational. I don't get bothered that I can't prove other minds exist. That doesn't bother me. It's not rational.
Well, I will tell you that since we started talking about that in an iron sharpens iron sense, Jackie, it's helped me grow, honestly, because I think sometimes I can get in that huddle of fact, right? Yeah. And I can get in that mode with my wife sometimes too, because I want the direct path. I want to plan it out to get there the fastest way. And she says, hey, there's a flower over here. I'm like, okay. The proverbial stop and smell the roses. Yeah. And that's been important. That's been an important qualitative aspect of my learning. And I appreciate that. And I think
Plantinga would say she's grounded without producing evidences.
Yes.
It's a different kind of grounding. So Jackie can be grounded with or without evidences. And I would never put it down, Jackie. Not only would I never put it down, sometimes I wished I could be like that. But that's not the way I was created. I think you're right about your belief, Jackie. I think you're right about how you come there. But personally, I'm the guy that says, now let's just see, are there 10 evidences? So,
and I respect that. Absolutely.
That's what I mean. You respect my view. And I'm not telling you this because we're on a live broadcast. I'm telling you because I honestly believe it. I am not just fine with your view. Like I said before, these things can be true. I just don't think there's 100 reasons for them, but it can be logically, how Plantinga says, airtight.
And I respect, I honestly do. I try to anyway, to respect my wife in that way, and Jackie and others that are like that. Where I try to humbly approach it is when they make a statement. If they make a statement, I have to bite my tongue sometimes, because it's like, I want to say there's a lot of reasons why that's not true. or I'm thinking, I'm shutting up sometimes, I'm thinking I could give you 10 reasons why that's not true, or I think that's not true.
Mm-hmm.
Usually though, Mike, if Jackie or my wife or mother would do that, if it's usually on smaller points that you can live without, don't need, they're extraneous. On the
Right.
big points about, like I said, God and immortality, the two biggies that atheists can't buy. There's a lot of evidence for those two. By the way, recent survey, you guys may have heard this. Recent survey among atheists and agnostics. How many of them believe in an afterlife? Atheists and agnostics only. I think the figure was like 32%, just under 1/3. And you go, oh, whoa, 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 time out. Your view does not exact that. And they go, yeah, but I believe it with all my heart. And you know what? I'll bet you it has a lot to do with NDEs.
Yeah, I'm sure. Any last thoughts, Gary?
No, I don't have any more. My website, GaryHabermas.com,
Mm-hmm.
and my YouTube channel, people can
Right.
find. I've got so many things on those. I'm working on my 8 million hits now for my website. So a lot of people go there. I'm happy for it. I'm not saying, look, I'm big. I'm saying if it's meeting people's needs, then I'm happy. We just had an incident. We don't know what happened, but the other day we had a rush on my website, GaryHabermas.com, that we got something like 27,000 hits in 36 hours. We don't know. Something went viral, and we don't know what it was, but it filled up. It filled up my website. It was you, Mike. Yeah, you.
Yeah, they heard that you were going to be on the Real Squabble.
That's it.
They were looking for links.
And I told I only teach PhD. I told my PhD students, look, I'm trying to give you the best I can by way of reasons. But we're back to Jackie now. I say, I try to give you the best reasons. But here's what you want to remember. I tell them, it's all about ministry. It's all about, to whom are you ministering? Whom do you deal with when they're going through doubts? Like the woman who wrote me an email a few weeks ago and said, help, help, help. I'm barely hanging on by my fingernails. And I think if someone doesn't talk to me, I'm going to lose my faith in the next few days. She wrote to me and told me that. Mike started the show by saying his doubt used to be emotional. About 70% of all doubt, according to stats, about 70% of all doubt is emotional. And you don't cure emotional doubt with evidences. So there's an example where our approach, Mike, isn't always the good one. You have to tell, I love C.S. Lewis, learn to tell your emotions where to get off. We have to introduce psychological principles that say, here's what you do emotionally when this happens. And emotional doubt is the most painful kind. It's the only one that's painful. So it's about ministries where I'm going. It's about helping hurting people, and that's where the rubber meets the road. That's kind of the thought.
All right, thanks. Hey, that concludes the show. I'd like to thank Dr. Gary Habermas for joining us today to talk about the soul, near-death experiences, and reincarnation. Check out his books, website, GaryHabermas.com, and his YouTube channel. Also, tell us what you think about the Real Squabble, suggest topics, and remember to like us on Facebook and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We'll see you next time on the Real Squabble.
Bye-bye.
Hey,